not just for hosting this event, but having the wonderful space of Busboys and Poets where so much great stuff happens. And I want to thank some of the folks who made the writing of this book possible. Our former Global Trade Watch research director, Todd Tucker, who did a lot of the research and helped with an earlier version. Our current research director, Ben Beachy, who did a very good edit, and a bunch of friends who did peer reviews and edits. So, fast track. As a practical matter, it's a legislative procedure. Seems kind of arcane and boring. So, why should people who are not trade wonks care? Why does it merit a whole book? Two big reasons. One, fast track is how the United States got into trade agreements, like the World Trade Organization, WTO, and NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreements. And the dirty little secret about those agreements is they're not mainly about trade. Rather, they impose constraints on a wide array of policies and give numerous new rights and powers to foreign investors that undermine both the practice and principle of democracy, but many of our most important non-trade laws on food safety, financial regulation, the environment, and more. This is intimately connected to fast track, would not have happened but for fast track, as I will explain. Number two, fast track has totally upended the balance of powers. And it basically ripped up, shredded, a vital check and balance built into the Constitution by the founders, dangerously concentrating what turns out to be vast power to unilaterally impose policies in a process that is heavily influenced by large corporations. Fast Track, among other things, officially empowered over 600 official corporate advisors who have access to texts that are so secret Congress doesn't see them, and to have direct input. And so even though Public Citizen, the organization where I work, is very focused for 40 years on good process to get good policy, Fast Track is even worse than the usual bad process, in that what it is basically allowed is a formalization of the use of trade agreements to, in a slow motion, coup d'etat, quietly take over democratic policy space that is vital, not just here but in other countries, to be able to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Now, as the last grant of Fast Track was coming to an end in 2007, before that, some of us started thinking, all right, this is outdated technology. As you're going to hear, it was cooked up around the time of 8-track tapes. Yes, it's 1973 technology of Richard Nixon. So we started thinking, what should replace it? It's way overdue. This doesn't make sense anymore. And in snooping around, we realized there wasn't any really good source of information that was primary source about the different ways this trade authority question had been dealt with. So, thanks to a grant from the Sloan Foundation, we were able to send researchers into the musty bowels of the Library of Congress, where they went through hundreds of volumes of 18th, 19th, and 20th century congressional records, statutes, law review articles, and news clips, and voila, we have the original picture, which is told largely in the book, which, believe it or not, is actually a fun read, and I'm not saying that because I'm the author, is told largely in the voice of the people who are participating in the debates in those days. And not to give away too much, because it's definitely worth reading, it's remarkable how, through the decades, some of the exact same warnings, words, fears, messages came out. There were in each 50 years of Congress, the prescient, the ignoring, the upset, the good Lord, this could undo the entire Constitution crowd. The story starts at the very beginning with the Boston Tea Party. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, our country was started with a trade war. It is a fact that is not largely known, but the whole fight was over border taxes, otherwise known as tariffs, on tea. So it was not a shocker that when the founders put together the Constitution, they were a little sensitive about how that issue of trade was going to get dealt with. They had just seen what happened when the king, literally, could unilaterally declare a trade policy that in that point was all about something else, his foreign entanglements in Europe. He needed cash to fight the Spanish. They were not having that. So the US Constitution has a very intentional check and balance in Article 1.8, where the legislative branch has exclusive authority over the contents of trade policy. Now, of course, the executive branch has exclusive authority to negotiate agreements. So over the history of the country, there's had to be some mechanism for sharing. And what our research found was that for 200 years, Congress was the body that made trade policy and wrote our laws until Fast Track. Fast Track, in a way that was able to slide under the radar, dramatically changed both roles. It undermined both roles of Congress, not just making trade policy, but writing non-trade laws. Over the last few decades, presidents, Democrats and Republicans alike, have used Fast Track to effectively diplomatically legislate, pushing through Congress policies that Congress would otherwise reject. But let's not jump to the head of our story. The first 100 years of the country, Congress kept very tight control on our trade policy. We found, in fact, there were 5 distinct eras of how Congress, and it was Congress's to do, delegated or didn't its authority on trade. 5 distinct periods. And Congress, holding control of the substance, makes Fast Track a striking anomaly, given, in fact, Fast Track, as we will learn, gave it all up. We're going to skip some of the 5 eras, though actually it's pretty interesting what was going on that led to some of the different fights. I'll just jump to 1890, which was the first time that Congress started experimenting with delegating some authority. The overarching theme would be Congress would start to delegate a little of its authority to the executive branch would grab it all and haul it away. Then Congress would say, we're not doing that, take it back. It went back and forth seesaw-like. So in the 1890s, Congress delegated some authority, the executive branch got a little carried away, got taken back. 1934 is the Reciprocal Tariffs Act. That was the big first major delegation. It let the executive branch negotiate agreements to do tariff cuts, but Congress set the bands for products, so how much could be cut for a particular product, but Congress didn't have to vote as long as the tariff cuts were in that set bands. They could be declared into place. It was just on goods, which we're going to learn is a big, important distinction. But it was supposed to be an emergency measure that, such a crisis, global depression, would go away in 3 years. The executive branch kept coming back, just 1 more year, 2 more years. And over time, Congress slowly started delegating chunks of it. It was under this authority that the original GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was negotiated, and 4 other sessions of negotiations of GATT. However, here comes Congress pulling it back in, because by 1958, as the importance of trade in the economy was increasing, but also the number of countries and issues getting more complicated, Congress realized that these trade negotiations that they didn't have a lot of control over were actually having a lot of impact. So they established a legislative veto at that point in their delegation authority. Then the Johnson administration comes to grab it all back. And Congress had delegated authority for what's called the Kennedy Round. This is the antecedent of Fast Track. Kennedy Round of GATT was the round that the Johnson administration was negotiating, and they had basically said, you can do tariffs, but nothing else. And Johnson, well, he said, show me. Ha. He ignored Congress, signed an agreement at GATT that actually rewrote some U.S. anti-dumping laws. That's still trade policy. And Congress, to basically exercise their prerogatives and slap back that incursion, said, all right, fine. We're not going to approve that part of the agreement. So Johnson was a little mortified, declared the tariff cuts. There was no trade authority for 10 years after that knockdown drag-out. Congress had it. In comes Richard Nixon, the next mechanism. So Nixon saw that crisis that had been caused by Johnson, as an argument for why he ought to come back with an even bigger grab of power. What he basically said is no countries would negotiate on the next round of the GATT